All right, Political Science 100. When we left off, we were talking about the concern, the grave concern that the founders had with the prospect of mob rule. They wanted a stronger central government, but they wanted to protect the powers inherent in that central government, not just from being used tyrannically by those in power, but more importantly, prevent them from being taken over by average people, of whom the founders had a very low opinion, a point we'll get back to when we talk in particular about topics like public opinion. So the founders wanted to design a constitutional system that would prevent factions from gaining control of government. And so they decided to do so by creating coordination problems and increasing transaction costs that would make it very difficult for people to band together and form factions and then take over the power of the government. So you can think of it in two ways. First, they wanted to make it very difficult for factions to be organized enough to have the organizational infrastructure to even have the ability to take over the controls of our government. And then secondly, to whatever extent any faction was able to even gain a foothold in government power, they designed a constitutional system that would make it difficult for that foothold alone to translate into controlling the entirety of government. The whole point behind our constitutional design is to check or to impede or to frustrate the influence of factions on government. So I want to get into some specifics about how. And the source of these specifics, the reason we know that the founders were thinking along these lines and that these were their goals in designing the Constitution, is that the most important people involved in designing the Constitution, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, wrote it all down for us. I'm not guessing here. We don't have to wonder what they were thinking. They told us what they were thinking. And they told us what they were thinking in a series of essays that collectively now are known as the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written as part of the ratification battle over the Constitution. So the Constitution had been drafted, but it had not yet been ratified. To be ratified, it had to get the approval of 9 of the 13 states. Remember, according to the Articles of Confederation, the threshold should have been all 13 states, but the founders jettisoned that idea and came up with a new standard of their own. And so there was concern about getting that many states to approve the Constitution, and one state in particular that the founders were worried about was the state of New York. Hamilton was from New York, and so he knew full well the difficulty of convincing that particular state to adopt a system of government in which the central government, the federal government, was greatly empowered at the expense of the states. So to try and persuade the state of New York to ratify the Constitution, Hamilton and James Madison and also John Jay, who was another founder, got together to write a series of essays under the pen name Publius, and they wrote these essays and published them in the New York newspapers. And the audience, the intended audience for these essays were the potential voters in the fight to ratify the Constitution. Hamilton wrote the vast majority of the essays. John Jay wrote only a few. I believe he took ill pretty soon into the project. But Madison wrote what are arguably the most important and influential Federalist Papers. And he wrote the two that I'm going to talk about here in terms of explaining what the founders had in mind in terms of the design of our Constitution. In Federalist number 10, Madison wrote about using the very size of the country as a tool, as a way to deal with faction control. And he had in mind dividing and conquering factions, spreading them out, diluting their resources. So he used the phrase, extend the sphere. Extend the geographic, literally the geographic area that the faction had to contend with. It had to spread itself out over in order to try and take control of government. He argued that if you divide the country into many small chunks, so a large area divided up into a bunch of small pieces, is preferable than having just a few large territories of legislative districts. So that's why we have currently today a House of Representatives that consists of 435 seats. And you can think of the 50 states for the Senate, but actually 2 senators for each state, so 100 really for the Senate. And our Electoral College, the device through which we elect the president, there are essentially 51, Washington, D.C. plus the 50 states, 51 Electoral College constituencies that have to be contended with to win the presidency. The whole point of all this is to make it difficult for factions to organize, to place infrastructure and organizational demands on factions that are beyond what they could muster in order to win elections. For example, consider the state of California. If a faction is trying to gain control of California as a legislative unit, and you're talking about a single election for the entire state, I mean, it's a big state. We cover a lot of territory, and a lot of people in the state. But if you're trying to win a single election, you could coordinate that single election from you've got just one race to run. And so if you're contesting for a single seat, you've got your candidate versus the other candidates. That's one thing. A state that's divided into 52 different legislative districts, which the state of California right now is, that's a whole other thing. To gain control of 52 seats, you have to win 27 of those to have majority control. Which 27 are you going to win? Unless you can somehow predict in advance the exact 27 seats that you will win and contest for only those seats, it's unlikely you'd be able to know ahead of time what that would be, so you have to contest all 52 seats. Your faction has to have organization and infrastructure and resources and people and staff and candidates, not competing for a single seat, but spread across 52 seats in the hopes of winning 27 of those to have majority control of the entirety. That's a much more daunting, difficult organizational challenge, which is the whole point. So again, we have 435 seats in the U.S. House, 100 Senate seats, 51 electoral college districts, spread across 3 million square miles of territory, the entire point of which is to make it very unlikely that a faction could contest for all of that. The founders believed that a faction could possibly gain a foothold in one part of the country, but would probably be offset by a competing faction in a different part of the country. It seemed very unlikely that any single faction would have the organizational power to be present and controlling and dominating in the entirety of the country. And this very idea of one faction offsetting another by competing against it and holding it in check, that concept is known as pluralism. Political pluralism is the idea that no entity, no organization, no power will completely dominate. But it may have strength in one particular part of the country or one particular area, but will be offset, will be held in check by a competing ideology or power or party or faction in some other part of the country. The idea behind Federalist number 10, as explained by Madison, is to, going back to the zombie metaphor, to keep the zombies outside the walls, to build a wall big enough they can't even get in. However, the founders, and I'm stretching the zombie metaphor a bit here, I understand, but the zombies left open kind of they left a back door to the house slightly cracked open that could let the zombies get in. And that is, they, according to the founders' design of the Constitution, stipulated that the people, average people like you and me, could directly elect members to the House of Representatives. This is where Federalist number 51 comes in. Federalist number 51 was another of the Federalist Papers, and this one also was written by James Madison. And this one is more mechanistic in its solution to faction control. And the metaphor that I'm trying to continue here with zombies is, if the zombies somehow managed to break in anyway, to get past the way they were, the wall that kept them outside of government, and again, the founders cracked open one door a little bit by allowing the people to directly elect members to the House of Representatives, how do you keep them from taking over the entirety of government? How do you keep them from infecting the entire house of government? And so what the image you see on the slide now is of a zombie safe house. You can see the main house up there, and clearly zombies could get into that thing by breaking windows or smashing open doors. But the safe house below ground is different. It's isolated, and each section is walled off from the others, so that even if a zombie contingency should happen to get into one part of it, it wouldn't necessarily be able to access the rest of it. And that's the idea I'm trying to get across in terms of the mechanistic solution for faction control that is explained by James Madison in Federalist number 51. This is more of the stuff that I'm sure you're familiar with. We have separate powers in our political system. Powers are separated across our institutions, across the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The entirety of government power is not contained in any one of those branches. Rather, different aspects of governing power are contained in each. We also have a separation of powers within our institutions. Specifically, the legislature we have a bicameral legislature. We have House and a Senate, and they play different roles and in some ways check each other. So we have a separation of powers within institutions, and we even have a sense of separate powers between levels of government when we think of state powers versus federal powers. And of course, as you know, those institutions can check and balance each other. Congress can pass laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can strike down the acts of the executive and legislative branches as unconstitutional. Each branch of government can check the other branches of government. The idea is to hold them all in check so that no one can dominate. That stuff is very familiar. The rest of this may be less familiar. By the founders' original design, we were to have almost exclusively indirect, not direct, but indirect selection of office holders to the national government. As I mentioned, the founders were okay with the people electing representatives to the House of Representatives. But that was the only institution of government to which the founders wanted we, the people, to actually have a direct say. Per their original design, the United States senators were chosen not by the people, but by the state legislators. And members of the judicial branch, the courts, were never elected. They were to be nominated by the president, who is indirectly elected as well through the Electoral College, and then confirmed by the Senate, indirectly selected. The people pick the state legislators, and the state legislators pick the senators from their states. So only the House of Representatives was intended to be directly accountable to the people. Everything else was indirect. There was a buffer between the people and the selection of office holders in every other part of government. Now we've opened that up. The Electoral College has never played the gatekeeping function that the founders had in mind, and we'll talk about that when we get to the presidency, I think. And also, we amended the Constitution to allow the people to directly elect United States senators. But again, that's not what the founders had in mind. They wanted to limit us, average people, to only the House of Representatives being directly accountable to us. In addition to that, they staggered the terms of office. Members of the House are elected every 2 years. Members of the Senate serve 6-year terms so that in any one given election, only a third of the Senate is up for grabs. The other 2/3 are not. And the presidency serves a 4-year term. What that does is, what it means is, in no single election is the entirety of government up for grabs. So you recall we talked about the possibility of a zombie faction, or not a zombie faction, excuse me, I'm getting my metaphors confused, a Robin Hood faction in the previous video. What's to stop a Robin Hood faction from deciding to tax the wealth of the haves and redistribute that to the have-nots? This is what's to stop that. That Robin Hood faction would have to take control of government sufficiently in order to do that, would have to first win a majority in the House of Representatives. So in the upcoming election, let's say in 2024, whatever year you want to imagine, they would have to win the House of Representatives in that election. But that doesn't get them very far. They might also get a third of the Senate at that point. But a third of the Senate doesn't get passage of the Robin Hood legislation. The other 2/3 of the Senate would never go for the Robin Hood legislation, so it's dead already. So in the next election, let's say 2026, the Robin Hood faction would have to again win control of the House. They'd have to keep their control of the House, keep the third of the Senate they have, and then win another third of the Senate. At that point, they would have a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate. There was a presidential election in there, which they'd have to win as well. So then they would have at least majority control of the legislative and executive branches of government. And that's still not enough, because without a doubt, the current Supreme Court would strike down any proposed Robin Hood legislation as being blatantly unconstitutional. So what would they have to do about that? Well, members of the court serve for life. Many of them right now, most of them in office right now are younger than I am. They're in their 50s. So they're going to be around for another 20, 30 years. This Robin Hood faction would have to keep winning the House and the Senate and the presidency through that entire time, with the hopes of Supreme Court justices retiring, dying off, and opening up spots on the court for them to put their Robin Hood judges in. The odds of this happening are so slim as to be non-existent, and that's exactly the point. The whole point of this system of power spread across institutions that can check and balance each other with very little direct input from the people and staggered terms of office to mute that even further, the whole point of that is to make it very difficult for a faction like a Robin Hood faction to actually take over and control our government. Because the founders didn't trust the people. They considered people to be susceptible to mob rule and zombies who would be acting in their own blatant self-interest without any concern for the greater good. Okay, another thing to think about in the Constitution is to talk about some of the principles, the design principles of our Constitution, our constitutional structure, and thinking about this in the context of the importance of political institutions and how the design of political institutions can either facilitate collective action by lowering transaction costs of doing something, or it can complicate or impede collective action by raising transaction costs. And of course, there's a trade-off. Transaction costs that go down raise conformity costs. Transaction costs that go up lower conformity costs. So I want to talk about 5 different principles of constitutional design with that in mind. And the first is delegation. We're a nation of 330 million people. And there's no way that a nation of 330 million people that we can all get together and have a conversation about what to do about healthcare or immigration or climate change or anything else. The conversation would be impossible to have. So to deal with that, a fundamental aspect of our governing system is the system of representation. We delegate the responsibility of having those conversations to our representatives, our elected representatives for the most part. The language that is often used, social scientists would talk about this in terms of principals and agents. The principals are us, the 330 million citizens. We delegate the authority to our agents, our elected officials, Congress, the president, to act on our behalf in the hopes that they do. The term for when our agents do something other than what we would have wanted them to do is called agency loss. And that's another way of thinking about conformity costs. When we entrust our agents to act on our behalf and they don't, we've just paid high conformity costs. We're having to conform to or live with actions that they did because we gave them the power, we delegated to them the power to act on our behalf, and they did something we didn't want them to do. In terms of understanding delegation and the associated costs with it, delegation lowers transaction costs. The transaction costs of a 330 million person conversation are through the roof. So much so that it just can't possibly happen. So the whole point of delegating is to lower the transaction cost, to make the conversation even possible, to reduce the number of participants down so it's small enough so that the time and effort it takes to have these conversations can actually happen. It's actually physically possible. But it potentially raises conformity costs. Again, think about agency loss. If our delegates do something other than what we wanted them to do on immigration, on climate change, on etc., then we've paid. That's the cost we pay for lowering the transaction costs and for delegating in the first place. The second tool or constitutional principle is command, and it's kind of like delegation except it's more extreme. Authority is given to a sole individual in some cases to decide and enforce collective agreements. We don't have a whole lot of command in our constitutional system. The founders were very nervous about empowering any one entity in our government with absolute authority. About the only example I can think of is the president serving as the commander-in-chief in the military. And even there's some gray area. If a president were to issue an unconstitutional order, the military does not have to obey an unconstitutional order. So the president is commander-in-chief, which normally means that whatever the president says, those he commands do. But even there, command is not absolute. In terms of costs, command very much lowers transaction costs. I mean, if a single person has entire command, all that person has to do, he or she simply says, this is what's going to happen. But of course, if that thing that he or she says is going to happen is an unpopular thing, then there are very high conformity costs associated with that. The third tool is the veto, and this is basically a negative power. It's the power to stop something from being done. And costs in terms of exercising the veto depend on how many veto holders there are. In terms of a presidential veto, when you're thinking about, Congress can pass a law, but it's not law until the president signs it. If the president decides to veto it, then he's stopped that law from going into effect. And there are very low transaction costs there. The president simply has to decide that he wants to veto a bill. Although potentially very high conformity costs if the bill that he's vetoing was a popular one among the people. The House and Senate can override that veto with a 2/3 majority in both chambers. So basically, vetoing the veto, which is itself an exercise of the veto power. In that one, there are very high transaction costs. It's very difficult to get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree on anything. I'm not sure we could get them to agree that today, as I'm recording this, it's a Monday. That's how divided the country is. So the transaction costs in getting the House and the Senate to override that veto are very high. 2/3 is a high threshold. But if that can happen, that would mean that there are a lot of representatives on board with doing so by definition, and so conformity costs would be low. The fourth power is agenda control. This is the power not really to decide something, but to decide what will be decided. And this is a pretty important power. One of the best examples I can think of in our Constitution is the fact that the Constitution gives the Supreme Court discretion as to what cases it will hear or not hear. When people utter the phrase, "I'm going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court," they're not. The Supreme Court hears a tiny fraction of the cases that are brought before it. The court exercises discretion in choosing only those cases that it thinks rest on a fundamental, important constitutional principle that needs to be resolved. So however important a matter may be to you personally, that doesn't mean the court's going to take it. So the court controls its own agenda, and that's an important power. It lowers transaction costs. I mean, the universe of possible decisions that a court could take on is vast. So having the discretion to just wade through that and cut out what you don't want to hear and focus only on what you do, that's an important power. However, as always, with lowering transaction costs, you potentially increase or raise conformity costs. If the cases that the Supreme Court refuses to hear are important cases that we need decided, those are unpopular moves, but yet the court has that power. And then the fifth and last principle of institutional design that I'll mention here is voting rules, by which I mean the different threshold that is required to approve something by a vote. You simply say, well, let's vote on it. And I think you have in mind whichever option gets the most votes wins, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. For example, you could insist on only a plurality of the vote being needed to pass something. Plurality simply means an option receiving more votes than any other option, not necessarily a majority. It's not that hard to reach a plurality. Something that has the support of 30% of the people can be a plurality winner in an election if every other option has less than 30%. What if there are 15 possible options, and we spoke in the previous video about President Trump having 30% support among Republican primary voters in 2016 because the other 70% was spread across 15 or so other candidates. So Trump was essentially the plurality choice, but that's by far not a majority choice. It's much harder to get a majority. Majority means 50% plus one. So in terms of transaction and conformity costs, achieving a plurality is fairly easy, so transaction costs are low, but you could have high conformity costs. You could have 70% of Republican voters not wanting Donald Trump, and yet he's their nominee. To get a majority is harder. So obviously the transaction costs go up. But as the transaction costs go up, conformity costs are lowered. If there was an insistence in the part of the primary voting process that a candidate had to at least have a majority of support from all primary voters, the conformity costs would therefore be less than half, because by definition, more than half the people would have supported the nominee. In some cases, you might want a supermajority to do something. If you want to make something really difficult to achieve, you require a supermajority, a 2/3 majority, or a 70% majority, or 3/4, whatever the number you like. That raises the transaction costs, but then again, by definition, lowers the conformity costs. If you really want to make something difficult, almost impossible to achieve, you insist on a unanimous support for it. The transaction costs of achieving unanimity are extraordinarily high. But by definition, the conformity costs are zero. If everybody supports it, no one is bummed when it's achieved, so there are no conformity costs. Here's an example of different kinds of voting thresholds for different procedures in the United States Senate. And this is from your text. Passing ordinary bills and amendments requires just a simple majority of the members who are present and voting. So whoever's on the Senate floor at the time voting on something, most things can pass with the majority of that people, just a bare majority. Some things require 3/5 of the full Senate, which would be 60 people. In ending a filibuster is an effort by a small minority in the Senate to block debate on something, and so they can extend a filibuster and stop legislation from proceeding. Closing that filibuster, invoking cloture, which is known as Rule 22, requires the support of 3/5 of the Senate. So 60 people have to be there, the full Senate, not just who was there and present, but the full body. Overriding a veto requires 2/3 of the Senate, so even higher than the 3/5 threshold. And taking up a piece of legislation out of the order in which it's scheduled requires the unanimous agreement of the members present. So, it's fairly easy to pass ordinary bills. It's harder to invoke Rule 22. It's even harder to override a veto, and it's really hard, all but impossible, to take up legislation out of turn. So that's an idea or example of how voting rules can affect these sorts of things. Okay, a couple of closing points. As I mentioned, the whole point of the Constitution was to empower the central government. The fundamental flaw in the Articles of Confederation was the weakness of the federal government. It led to rampant collective action problems with coordination and prisoners' dilemmas among the states, and the country was going down. We were not going to be an independent nation for much longer, given the weaknesses of our country and our government under the Articles. So the point of the Constitution was to strengthen and nationalize American politics. This debate between the rights of states and what should be the purview of state governments versus the federal authority, that was a fault line in American politics in the 1780s, and it's a fault line in American politics today. And we'll talk about that at length in different respects throughout this class. So the Constitution was the first step in increasing the importance and the power of the federal government. And that step was not actually finalized, and it wasn't actually sort of solidified that national government authority supersedes that of states until the Civil War. I mean, the whole point of the Civil War, the point of the South seceding, was the refusal of the Southern states to subject themselves to federal authority, particularly when that federal authority was aimed at abolishing slavery and dealing a death blow to the Southern economic system built around slave labor and the cotton industry. So this is no small thing, the nationalization of American politics. How is the Constitution doing today in an era of highly polarized politics? The founders designed a system of government that spread power across institutions that can check and balance each other, the whole point of which was to make policy making difficult. A lot of consensus is required in our system to get much done. It's much easier to block things from happening than to enact things. The emergence of political parties, which the founders did not anticipate, they argued against parties. George Washington, in his farewell address as he left the presidency, most famously warned against the development of political parties in America. He thought it would be a terrible thing. Likewise, Hamilton and some others really were concerned about the growth of partisan politics. Political parties and partisanship adds another layer of conflict over this divided system. And when you've got a highly polarized, highly partisan era like we're in today, such that our opposing political parties, Republican and Democrat, are almost effectively warring tribes, that makes it even harder still. Unless there is unified partisan control across the institutions of government, unless a single party has a majority in the House and the Senate, controls the presidency, and has a majority on the courts, which basically never happens, it becomes all but impossible to accomplish much in the American political system. The founders wanted it to be difficult. They designed the system so that policymaking would be difficult. They didn't design it to be impossible. And the high level of partisan division papered over, layered on top of the already divided system across our institutions of government makes policymaking almost impossible today. And so the result is gridlock. The result is pressing issues, a few of which we've mentioned so far. Things like the need to reform our immigration system, or address the problems of Social Security, take on climate change, you name it. Our system of government does not leave the country well positioned to make effective strides on those issues because of the gridlock and because of the great divide caused by highly partisan politics in an already divided political system that is part of our constitutional design. And as we go through the class, I'm sure we'll talk about many examples that make that point. Okay, that's it for the Constitution. There is a great deal more detail on many of these points and much more depth on many of these points in the text, so please be sure to read that. And when we come back, we will take up the topic of federalism.